When a CEO shows up at a single father's store at midnight with mascara running down her face, something is about to change. Randy Samuel had no idea just how much his life was about to flip upside down. But to understand what happened next, the story has to start in the dark, in the quiet, in a moment he would never forget. 3 weeks before Adriana showed up at his door, Randy had been riding the elevator alone. He worked on the fourth floor, accounts payable, the department nobody visited unless something was wrong with their reimbursement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that seemed designed to remind everyone exactly where they stood in the corporate hierarchy. Randy had learned to tune it out years ago, the same way he had learned to tune out a lot of things. He was on the phone with Jalen's kindergarten teacher trying to explain why he would be 15 minutes late for pickup again. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried that particular blend of patience and judgment that teachers reserve for parents who consistently fell short of expectations. Randy pressed the phone closer to his ear, lowering his voice as the elevator continued its descent. His words came out measured, careful, the way they always did when he needed someone to understand something they probably never would. He told her he understood this was the third time this month. He told her he knew the policy. He told her he was doing everything he could. And then, without thinking about it, without calculating how it might sound, he said the words that would change everything. "I'm always there. I promise I will be there. I'm always there for him." The elevator stopped on the 32nd floor with a soft chime. The doors slid open and Adriana Wells stepped inside. Randy recognized her immediately. Everyone in the building knew the CEO. She was the woman who had taken a struggling tech company and turned it into a billion-dollar enterprise in under 5 years. Magazine covers called her a visionary. Business journals called her a genius. The employees on the fourth floor called her nothing at all because people like Randy didn't talk about people like Adriana Wells. They simply existed in different universes that happened to share the same building. She was tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of posture that suggested she had never once questioned whether she belonged in any room she entered. Her blazer probably cost more than Randy's monthly rent. Her heels clicked against the elevator floor with a precision that seemed almost aggressive. Everything about her radiated control, competence, and absolute certainty about her place in the world. Randy lowered his voice further but kept talking. He couldn't hang up on Mrs. Patterson, not when she was already frustrated, not when his son's well-being depended on maintaining this fragile relationship with the school. He finished his explanation, repeated his promise, and ended the call, just as the elevator began its final descent to the lobby. Adriana stood 3 feet away, staring at the digital numbers above the door. She didn't acknowledge him. Her eyes never left that glowing display, watching the numbers count down like they contained information only she could decipher. Randy stood in the opposite corner, phone still warm in his hand, acutely aware of the space between them. He didn't expect her to notice him. People like Adriana Wells didn't notice people like Randy Samuel. That was simply how the world worked. He had spent 34 years learning this lesson in 1,000 different ways, and he had long ago stopped expecting anything different. But just before the doors opened on the lobby, she turned her head slightly. Not enough to look at him directly. Not enough for anyone watching to say she had acknowledged his existence. Just enough to let him know she had been listening. Randy stepped out, first nodded politely without making eye contact, and walked toward the parking garage. His mind was already on Jalen on the drive across town on the apology he would need to deliver to Mrs. Patterson's face instead of her ear. He didn't think about the elevator again. Adriana did. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Randy's apartment, casting long shadows across the cluttered living room. He moved through the space with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this alone for 3 years. The coffee maker gurgled. The toaster clicked. His body operated on autopilot while his mind ran through the calculations that governed his existence. Rent was due in 8 days, $1,100. The electric bill sat on the counter unopened but not forgotten, $180. Health insurance for him and Jalen had gone up again this year, $340 monthly. He added the numbers in his head the way other people might count sheep, a ritual that brought no comfort but had become impossible to stop. The checking account showed $847. The math didn't work. The math never worked. But somehow every month, Randy made it work anyway through careful juggling and creative timing and the kind of financial gymnastics that would have impressed his former colleagues at Deloitte. They had called him meticulous back then. Obsessive, some said, though they meant it as a compliment. Now those same skills that had once earned him six figures kept him and his son one paycheck away from disaster. Jalin emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes with one small fist. 5 years old with his mother's wide brown eyes and his father's stubborn chin. He wore pajamas covered in cartoon dinosaurs, a gift from Randy's mother that had arrived 3 months ago, with a note about how children grow too fast. She wasn't wrong. The pants were already getting short. The boy climbed onto his chair at the kitchen table, still half asleep, and watched his father pour cereal into a bowl. Milk followed, measured carefully because they were halfway through the gallon and payday was still 4 days away. Jalin's voice was soft with morning drowsiness when he asked if he could bring his new drawing to school today. Randy glanced at the refrigerator where a dozen crayon masterpieces covered every available surface. Stick figures dominated most of them. Houses with impossibly large suns, trees that looked like green lollipops. And always in every single picture, two figures holding hands, one tall, one small. Which drawing, buddy? The one with Daddy and me fishing. Jalin pointed at a piece of paper Randy hadn't noticed before, tucked between the electric bill and a coupon for pizza that would expire before they could afford to use it. The drawing showed two figures standing by a blue squiggle that might have been a river or a road. A fish hung between them, roughly the size of a small car. Randy studied the artwork with the seriousness it deserved. That's a big fish. The biggest. Jalin's eyes lit up with the absolute certainty of childhood. We're going to catch it together. Just you and me, Daddy. We don't need anybody else. The words hit Randy in a place he hadn't known was still vulnerable. He managed a smile, reached out to ruffle his son's hair, and agreed that they didn't need anybody else. Just the two of them against the world. It had been that way since Jalin was barely walking, since the morning Randy woke up to find a note on the kitchen table and closets half empty and a silence in the apartment that had never quite gone away. He didn't look at the photo frame on the bookshelf, the one he had turned face down 2 years ago. Jalin never asked about it. Maybe he was too young to remember what it had looked like facing out. Maybe he simply understood, in that intuitive way children sometimes did, that some questions were better left unasked. The drive to Mrs. Patterson's early drop-off program took 23 minutes on a good day. Today was not a good day. Traffic crawled along the interstate while Randy watched the clock on his dashboard count away the minutes he couldn't afford to lose. Jalin sat in his car seat humming a song he had learned at school, oblivious to his father's quiet desperation. They made it with 4 minutes to spare. Randy walked his son to the door, signed the check-in sheet, and exchanged the necessary pleasantries with the teaching assistant who always looked at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Single father, black, working class. The pieces didn't fit into any box she understood, so she just kept staring, waiting for the picture to make sense. Randy had stopped trying to make sense to people like her. He just signed the sheet, kissed his son goodbye, and promised to be there at 3:30. On time. Like always. The words echoed in his head as he drove to work. I'm always there. Such a simple statement. Such an impossible promise. But he made it anyway every single day because that was what fathers did. That was what he did. Even when the world seemed designed to make keeping that promise as difficult as humanly possible. The office building rose 28 stories above downtown Cleveland, a monument to corporate ambition wrapped in glass and steel. Randy parked in the garage on the lowest level where the monthly rates were cheapest and took the stairs to the 4th floor. The elevator was faster, but the stairs gave him time to transition, to put on the version of himself that survived in this environment. Quiet, competent, invisible. The 4th floor smelled like recycled air and old coffee. Cubicles stretched in every direction, gray fabric walls creating a maze that seemed specifically designed to crush the human spirit. Randy navigated it without conscious thought, his feet knowing the path to his desk, the way his hands knew how to tie his son's shoes. His workstation occupied a corner near the emergency exit, as far from the windows as it was possible to be, while still technically being in the building. No natural light reached this part of the floor. No executives ever wandered through. It was the kind of place where people could spend entire careers without anyone noticing they existed. Randy preferred it that way. He had just settled into his chair when Marcus Thompson appeared at the edge of his cubicle. 52 years old, gray, starting to pepper his close-cropped hair. Marcus had worked accounts payable for 15 years. He had watched colleagues come and go, had trained half the department, and had never once been promoted. He claimed he didn't mind. Randy believed him about half the time. Heard you were late again yesterday. Marcus kept his voice low, the way everyone on this floor kept their voices low, as if speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention. Randy didn't look up from his computer. Traffic, Marcus made a sound that might have been sympathy or might have been recognition. Same thing that was traffic when my kids were young. 20 years later, they still don't understand why Daddy was always running. Randy appreciated that Marcus never asked directly, never pried, just offered these small moments of solidarity, these acknowledgments that they were fighting the same invisible war. It was the closest thing to friendship Randy allowed himself in this building. Your boy, okay? He's good. Made me a drawing of a fish the size of a boat. Marcus laughed softly. They do that? My youngest used to draw me as a superhero, cape and everything. Thought I could fleeting. What happened? She grew up. Marcus shrugged, but something sad flickered behind his eyes. Found out I couldn't fly after all. None of us can. We just keep jumping and hoping we land somewhere soft. He moved on before Randy could respond, disappearing into the maze of cubicles to begin his own day of quiet survival. Randy stared at his computer screen, thinking about capes and fish and the weight of promises you couldn't keep. The morning passed in a blur of spreadsheets and reconciliation reports. Numbers flowed across Randy's screen, telling stories that only someone with his training could read. A decimal point out of place here. A date entered incorrectly there. The kind of errors that seem meaningless in isolation, but could cascade into disaster if left unchecked. He caught 3 mistakes before lunch. Each one saved the company money, prevented problems, kept the machinery running smoothly. No one would thank him. No one would notice. That was the nature of work like this. Success meant invisibility. Failure meant attention of the worst kind. His phone buzzed just before noon, a text from a number he didn't recognize, which was strange because Randy's phone received texts from exactly 4 people. His mother, Mrs. Patterson, the dentist's office, and the pharmacy where he picked up Jalen's allergy medication. The message was from Adriana Wells's executive assistant. Formal, polite, requesting Randy's presence in a conference room on the 20th floor for the quarterly merger meeting. His supervisor had called in sick. Someone needed to present the accounts payable reconciliation report. Randy read the message 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding something. People on the 4th floor didn't get invited to merger meetings. People on the 4th floor didn't present anything to anyone. They processed and filed and stayed invisible while the real work happened 20 floors above their heads. But his supervisor was sick, and the report needed presenting. And apparently Randy was the only person left who understood the numbers well enough to explain them. He closed his spreadsheet, straightened his tie, and walked toward the elevator he usually avoided. The doors opened with that same soft chime. The car was empty this time. No CEO in designer heels. No moment of accidental connection. Just Randy alone with his reflection in the polished steel doors, wondering what he had done to deserve this particular form of punishment. The conference room on the 20th floor was everything the 4th floor was not. Natural light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a table long enough to seat 20. Crystal water glasses stood at attention beside leather folders stamped with the company logo. The chairs probably would cost more than Randy's car. He arrived early because arriving early was the only way to control anything in situations like this. He chose a seat at the far end of the table as close to the door as possible and opened his laptop to review the numbers one final time. Directors and executives began filtering in over the next 15 minutes. They moved with the easy confidence of people who belonged here, greeting each other by first name, making jokes about golf games and vacation homes. Nobody acknowledged Randy. A few glanced in his direction with the mild curiosity one might show a new piece of furniture, then looked away and continued their conversations. Harrison Reynolds arrived 5 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start, Senior Vice President of Operations, 55 years old. The kind of man who had never been told no in his entire life and carried that certainty in every gesture. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Randy made in 2 weeks and a watch that could have paid off Jalen's entire year of kindergarten. Reynolds took a seat near the head of the table without looking at anyone else in the room. His presence shifted the energy immediately. Conversations became quieter. Postures became straighter. Even the sunlight seemed to dim slightly, as if it too recognized who held power in this space. Adriana Wells entered last. She moved through the doorway with that same controlled precision Randy remembered from the elevator. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that silenced the remaining chatter. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew who she was and what she was capable of. She took her place at the head of the table and opened her leather folder. Her eyes swept across the assembled executives, cataloging faces, taking mental notes. When her gaze passed over Randy, it lingered for exactly 1 second longer than it did on anyone else. Then she looked away and the meeting began. The first hour was brutal. The merger was not going well. Numbers didn't add up. Projections had been missed by margins that made people shift uncomfortably in their expensive chairs. Someone was going to take the blame. The only question was who. Harrison Reynolds answered that question at minute 63. He stood up, walked to the presentation screen, and pointed at a set of figures that Randy recognized immediately. The accounts payable reconciliation numbers, the ones he had been preparing to present. The discrepancy is right here. Reynolds' voice carried the absolute confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything. Your department entered incorrect figures. This is why we're $3.2 million short on the projection. Every eye in the room slid toward Randy, the only representative from accounts payable, the lowest-ranking person at the table, the black man in a room full of white executives who had already decided what story they wanted this meeting to tell. Randy felt the weight of those gazes pressing down on him. He knew what was expected. Nod. Apologize on behalf of the department. Let the meeting move forward. Accept responsibility for something that wasn't his fault, because fighting would only make things worse. That was the safe play. That was what he had always done. That was how you survived in a world that didn't give second chances to men who looked like him. His fingers moved to close his laptop. His mouth opened to form the words of surrender. And then he thought about Jolin, about the drawing on the refrigerator, about two stick figures holding hands facing a fish the size of the world, about what it would mean to teach his son that backing down was the only way to live. With respect, sir. Randy's voice emerged calm and even surprising even himself. The figures we submitted were accurate. The discrepancy comes from the Q2 revenue adjustment that operations requested in April. I have the email chain here along with the original numbers and the revised numbers your team approved. He turned his laptop screen toward the table before anyone could stop him. The data was clear. The timeline was undeniable. The mistake belonged to operations, not accounting. The room went absolutely silent. Harrison Reynolds' face transformed from confident to confused to furious in the span of 3 seconds. His mouth opened and closed twice, searching for words that wouldn't come. Nobody in this room had ever contradicted him. Nobody had ever presented evidence that proved him wrong. Nobody had ever been stupid enough to try. He took a breath, preparing to unleash whatever destruction was coming, and Randy braced himself for the end of his career. You don't embarrass a man like Harrison Reynolds and keep your job. That was simply how power worked. But before Reynolds could speak, another voice cut through the tension. Thank you, mister. Adriana Wells glanced down at the attendance sheet, and her eyes returned to Randy with an expression he couldn't read. Samuel, please send those documents to my office after the meeting. Randy managed to nod. Yes, ma'am. The meeting continued for another 45 minutes, but the energy had shifted. Reynolds sat back down, still seething, but contained. The other executives avoided looking at Randy entirely as if he had suddenly become radioactive. Nobody mentioned accounts payable again. When it was finally over, Randy gathered his laptop and prepared to slip out as quietly as possible. He had made it to the doorway when he felt the weight of someone's attention on his back. He turned to find Adriana Wells watching him from across the room. Her expression still revealed nothing. No approval, no condemnation, just observation as if she were collecting data about something she hadn't quite figured out yet. Randy held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he nodded politely, the same way he had in the elevator, and walked out the door. He didn't think about her watching him go. He didn't think about what it might mean that she had intervened when Reynolds was about to destroy him. He didn't think about any of it. He just got in his car, drove across town, and arrived at Mrs. Patterson's classroom at exactly 3:28. 2 minutes early, just like always. Jolin came running out with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, waving a new drawing that apparently featured a dragon wearing sneakers. Randy scooped him up, breathed in the smell of finger paint and apple juice, and felt the tension of the past few hours begin to dissolve. Daddy, the dragon has your shoes. Randy looked at the drawing. The dragon did in fact appear to be wearing very small versions of his work shoes. How did he get my shoes? He borrowed them. Jolin said this as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Because dragons need shoes too, Daddy. Their feet get cold, Makes sense. They walked to the car together, Jalen chattering about his day while Randy listened with half his attention. The other half was still back in that conference room, replaying what had happened, trying to understand why he had spoken up instead of staying silent. Why he had risked everything for the sake of numbers that would have been forgotten by next quarter anyway. He didn't have an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe sometimes you just reached a point where staying invisible became more painful than being seen. That afternoon, sitting in the parking lot while Jalen colored in the back seat, Randy's phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender line showed Adriana Wells' assistant. The subject line contained 2 words, meeting request. Randy stared at the notification for a long time. Then he put the phone away, started the car, and drove his son home for dinner. The next 2 weeks passed in a kind of suspended animation. Randy went to work. He processed spreadsheets. He attended the meeting that Adriana's assistant had scheduled, which turned out to be a brief professional conversation about document formatting that could have been handled in an email. He picked up Jalen from school every day at exactly 3:30. He made dinners that stretched their grocery budget as far as it could go. He read bedtime stories about dragons and dinosaurs and fish the size of boats. But something had changed. He could feel it in the way his coworkers looked at him now, a mixture of curiosity and wariness that hadn't been there before. Word had spread about the merger meeting, about how the accountant from the 4th floor had contradicted Harrison Reynolds and somehow survived. People whispered about it in the break room, fell silent when Randy walked past. Marcus Thompson was the only one who mentioned it directly. They were standing by the coffee machine on a Thursday morning when the older man leaned in close. "You know you're lucky to still be here, right?" Randy poured his coffee without looking up. Lucky's one word for it. Reynolds has destroyed people for less, much less. Marcus shook his head slowly, but the CEO stepped in. "Nobody's ever seen her do that before. People are talking. Let them talk." "I'm serious, Randy." Marcus's voice dropped even lower. "Something's going on. You might want to be careful." Randy thought about carefulness, about the 34 years he had spent being careful, about where it had gotten him, a 4th-floor cubicle, an apartment he could barely afford, a life constructed entirely around not being noticed. He took his coffee back to his desk and didn't say anything else. That night, while Jalen slept with his dragon drawing clutched against his chest, Randy sat at the kitchen table and looked at the bills spread out before him. The math still didn't work. It never did. But somehow he would make it work anyway. He always did. His phone buzzed. Another email. Adriana's assistant again. Another meeting request, this time for the following morning. Randy accepted without hesitation. Not because he wanted to. Not because he understood what was happening. Simply because refusing would require an explanation he didn't have. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. Adriana asked about his background. He told her about Deloitte, about the years he had spent auditing Fortune 500 companies before his life changed. She listened without expression, asked a few follow-up questions, thanked him for his time. He left more confused than when he arrived. The next meeting was 3 days later, then 2 days after that, then every other day for a week. Always brief, always professional, and always leaving Randy with more questions than answers. He stopped trying to figure out what she wanted, started simply showing up when summoned, providing whatever information she requested, and returning to his cubicle to process spreadsheets. If this was some elaborate form of corporate torture, he would endure it. If it was something else, he would figure that out eventually. Marcus watched all of this with growing concern. "You're playing with fire. I'm not playing with anything. The CEO is meeting with you personally, repeatedly. That's not normal, Randy. That's not how things work." Randy didn't have an answer for that, because Marcus was right. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how things worked. But nothing in Randy's life had been normal since the morning he woke up to an empty bed and a note that said his dreams were too small for someone who wanted more. 3 weeks after the merger meeting on a Saturday night that felt exactly like every other Saturday night in Randy's carefully controlled existence, everything changed. He had put Jalen to bed at 8 o'clock, read the story about the dragon with cold feet, answered questions about why the moon changed shape and whether fish had dreams, and what Daddy was thinking about when he got that faraway look in his eyes. Finally, mercifully, Jalen's eyes had fluttered closed, and Randy had tucked the blanket around his small shoulders and crept out of the room. The apartment was quiet in that particular way that only single parents understood. The silence of a life lived in whispers of footsteps softened to avoid disturbing the most precious thing in the world. Randy moved through it like a ghost, cleaning up the dinner dishes, folding the laundry that had been sitting in the basket for 3 days, doing all the small tasks that accumulated when you were the only adult responsible for everything. He was thinking about the electric bill, about whether he could push the due date by another week when the knock came. Not a buzzer from the lobby, not a ring of the doorbell, a knock. On his door. At 11:47 at night. Randy's first thought was danger. His second thought was police. His third thought was the landlord who sometimes showed up unannounced with vague complaints about noise that never seemed to lead anywhere. He approached the door carefully, wishing not for the first time that he had invested in a peephole. His hand found the deadbolt. His eye found the crack between door and frame. Adriana Wells stood in his hallway. She was still wearing what must have been work clothes, though the blazer was missing and the silk blouse was rumpled in a way he had never seen before. Her hair had come loose from its usual perfect arrangement. Her makeup had smeared black streaks running down her cheeks where tears had carved their paths. She looked like a woman who had just survived a car crash or caused one. Randy opened the door but didn't step aside. His mind raced through possibilities, through dangers, through everything he knew about the world and its rules. A black man alone with a white woman, his CEO, in the middle of the night. If anyone saw, if anyone talked, if she decided tomorrow that this was a mistake and needed someone to blame. His entire body wanted to close the door. His entire history told him to protect himself. Every lesson he had ever learned about survival screamed at him to retreat. Adriana's voice cracked on the words that came out. She told him she knew this was crazy. She told him she knew he could call the police. She told him she knew he could lose his job just for letting her stand there. But she didn't have anywhere else to go. Nowhere, no one. 247 contacts in her phone. Not one of them had called. Randy looked at this woman who ran a billion-dollar company, who commanded boardrooms, who had more power in her smallest finger than he would accumulate in his entire lifetime. He saw the mascara running down her face. He saw the way her hands trembled at her sides. He saw loneliness so profound it had become its own kind of gravity, pulling her across the city to the door of a man she barely knew. He thought about Jalen asleep in the next room, about what he taught his son every single day, about kindness and courage and not turning away from people who needed help. He thought about what kind of father he would be if he closed this door. 15 minutes. His voice came out quiet but firm. I have a child sleeping. Keep your voice down. He stepped aside. Adriana entered his apartment like someone walking into a foreign country. Her eyes moved across everything, cataloging details that probably seemed impossible to her. The second-hand couch with the torn armrest that Randy kept meaning to fix. The stack of children's books on the coffee table, library stamps visible on their spines. The crayon drawings taped crookedly to the refrigerator, their edges curling in the kitchen heat. The half-finished bowl of cereal Randy hadn't had time to wash that morning. She sat down on the couch and stared at the wall where Jalen's artwork hung. The house with the impossibly large sun. The two stick figures holding hands, one tall and one small. The fish the size of a boat that they would catch together someday. And then she started to cry. Not the polished tears that powerful people learn to deploy strategically. Not the controlled emotion of someone who had spent decades managing her image. These were ugly, heaving sobs that shook her entire body, that seemed to come from somewhere so deep inside her that Randy wondered if even she knew they existed. He stood frozen by the kitchen counter, unsure whether to sit to speak or to pretend he wasn't watching his CEO fall apart on his secondhand furniture. Nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. Nothing in his careful planning had accounted for this possibility. The words came out between sobs, fragmented and raw. Her husband, cheating. 2 years. She had found out a year ago but hadn't done anything. Thought maybe she was wrong. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe if she just worked harder, was home more, was better, somehow it would stop being true. They had signed the divorce papers that night. And when she got back to her apartment, to her penthouse with its view of the city and its designer furniture and its absolute emptiness, she had realized something that broke whatever was left of her composure. No one called. Not one person in her entire life had thought to check on her. Not one of the 247 names in her phone cared enough to ask if she was okay. Randy didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. Words seemed inadequate, almost offensive in the face of this much pain. Adriana looked up at him, mascara smeared into dark circles under her eyes, and asked if he knew why she had come here. Why him? Why this apartment in this neighborhood at this hour? He waited. She told him about the elevator, about hearing him on the phone with his son's teacher, about those 3 words that had echoed in her head for 3 weeks. I'm always there. No one had ever said that to her. Not her parents, who had been too busy building their own empire to notice their daughter. Not her husband, who had apparently been too busy with someone else. Not anyone ever in her entire carefully constructed life. She had spent 42 years making sure she didn't need anyone to say those words. Building walls, accumulating power, becoming so successful that needing people became irrelevant. And tonight, sitting alone in her penthouse, she couldn't stop thinking about how Randy had said those words. Like he meant them. Like they were the simplest truth in the world. Like being there for someone wasn't a burden or an obligation, but just what you did when you loved them. Her voice broke again. She had thought maybe, just maybe, there was one person in that building who wouldn't look at her and see a title. One person who wouldn't be afraid of her or try to use her. One person who might understand what it felt like to be completely alone while surrounded by people. Randy exhaled slowly. He moved to the armchair across from her, keeping the coffee table between them. The distance felt important. The boundaries felt necessary. His words came out careful, measured. He told her he wasn't her therapist. He wasn't her friend. And tomorrow, when they were both back in that building, he would still be a low-level accountant, and she would still be the CEO. She needed to understand that. She nodded. He asked what she actually needed right now. Not career advice, not someone to fix her life. Just tonight. Just this moment. Adriana looked around the small apartment again, at the toys on the floor, at the colorful artwork on the walls, at the evidence of a life actually being lived instead of just performed. She just needed to sit somewhere that felt like someone lived there. Just for a little while. That was all. Randy studied her face for a long moment. He saw the exhaustion carved into every line. He saw loneliness so deep it had become its own kind of wound. And underneath all of it, he saw something he recognized from his own mirror. The look of someone whose entire carefully constructed existence was starting to crack. He stood and walked to the kitchen, announced he was making tea. She could stay until the water boiled. Then she needed to leave. Adriana nodded, but they both knew the water would take longer than 15 minutes. They both knew something had already begun. They both knew that some doors once opened could never quite be closed again. Randy filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The blue flame flickered to life beneath it. In the other room, he could hear Adriana's breathing start to slow, the sobs subsiding into something quieter, but no less broken. And somewhere in the back of the apartment, in a small bedroom filled with dinosaur pajamas and dragon drawings, a 5-year-old boy dreamed of fish the size of boats and fathers who were always there. The night had just begun. The morning after Adriana left, Randy woke before his alarm. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the previous night in fragments that refused to form a coherent picture. The CEO of his company had sat on his torn couch and wept. She had drunk tea from the chipped mug Jelen had painted at a church fundraiser 2 years ago. She had stayed for nearly 2 hours long past when the water boiled, saying almost nothing after her initial confession, just sitting in the silence of his apartment as if absorbing something she couldn't find anywhere else. She had left around 2 in the morning with a quiet thank you that carried more weight than any words Randy had heard in years. He had watched her walk to the elevator, had seen her shoulders straighten as she approached the doors, had witnessed the transformation back into the woman the world expected her to be. By the time the elevator arrived, Adriana Wells, the CEO, had returned. The woman who had cried on his couch had disappeared entirely. Randy made coffee and started breakfast before Jalen woke up. The routine felt different now, contaminated somehow by the secret he was carrying. He cracked eggs into a pan and thought about consequences, about what it meant that he knew something about Adriana Wells that probably no one else in the company knew, about how that knowledge could be used against him or against her or against both of them in ways he couldn't predict. He had spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, keeping his head down, staying invisible, not giving anyone ammunition that could be turned against him later. And now in one night, he had acquired enough ammunition to destroy careers, including his own. Jalen emerged from his bedroom clutching the dragon drawing, which had apparently become a security object overnight. He climbed into his chair and asked why Daddy looked tired. Randy managed a smile. Just thinking about grown-up stuff. Is grown-up stuff boring sometimes? Mostly it's just complicated. Jalen considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher examining a particularly thorny ethical problem. When I'm grown up, I'm not going to think about complicated stuff. I'm just going to draw dragons all day. That sounds like a good plan, buddy. They ate breakfast together while morning light crept across the kitchen floor. Randy watched his son attack scrambled eggs with the enthusiasm he brought to everything and felt a familiar ache in his chest. This was what mattered. This small person with egg on his chin and dreams of dragons. Everything else was just noise. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He glanced at it while Jalen wasn't looking. "Thank you for last night. I mean it." Randy stared at the message for 30 seconds. Then he deleted it without responding, cleared his browser history out of habit, and went back to watching his son eat breakfast. The office felt different when he arrived. Nothing had visibly changed, but Randy's perception had shifted in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He looked at the building's glass facade and thought about the woman on the 32nd floor, wondered if she was already there, wondered if she had slept at all. He took the stairs to the 4th floor and wondered if he would ever see her in the elevator again. Marcus was waiting at his desk with 2 cups of coffee. One he handed to Randy without a word. The other he kept for himself while settling into the visitor chair that nobody ever used. "You look like hell." "Thanks." Randy took the coffee gratefully. "Didn't sleep well." "Want to talk about it?" "No." Marcus nodded, accepting this without offense. They had known each other long enough to understand that some questions were just formalities, ways of acknowledging concern without demanding explanation. The older man sat in comfortable silence for a moment, then stood and headed back to his own desk. Randy spent the morning buried in spreadsheets, using numbers as a shield against thought. The familiar rhythm of data entry and reconciliation created a kind of meditation, a state where nothing existed except the next cell, the next formula, the next verification. He had always been good at this, at disappearing into work so completely that everything else fell away. But today the disappearance wouldn't hold. His mind kept drifting back to the night before, to Adriana's face when she talked about her husband, to the raw desperation in her voice when she asked why she had come to him, to the way she had looked at Jalen's drawings like they contained answers to questions she hadn't known she was asking. He caught himself checking his phone every few minutes, looking for messages that didn't come. This was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of behavior that led to complications, to entanglements, to the destruction of carefully constructed lives. He needed to stop. He put his phone in his desk drawer and didn't look at it again until lunch. 3 days passed without contact. Randy went to work, processed spreadsheets, picked up. Jalen made dinner, read bedtime stories, and tried not to think about the woman on the 32nd floor. He succeeded during the day when there were tasks to complete and responsibilities to fulfill. The nights were harder. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was doing the same thing 30 floors above his office. On the 4th night, Jalen broke through the walls where Randy had been building. They were at the kitchen table working through a reading assignment that involved matching pictures to words. Jalen was doing well, sounding out letters with the careful concentration of someone learning a new language. Randy watched with the quiet pride that came from seeing his son grow, learn, become more himself with each passing day. Then Jalen looked up from his book with that particular expression that meant a question was coming. "Daddy, is the crying lady okay?" Randy's pen stopped mid-correction. "What crying lady?" Jalen tilted his head in that way he had the gesture that suggested Randy was being deliberately obtuse. "The pretty lady who came to our house. I woke up and saw her sitting on the couch. She was crying really hard." The words hit Randy like cold water. He had been so careful to keep his voice low, to keep the living room door mostly closed. He had assumed Jalen had slept through everything. But 5-year-olds heard more than anyone gave them credit for. They saw more. They understood more. "She's fine." Randy kept his voice carefully neutral. "She was just having a hard night." Jalen accepted this with the easy trust of childhood. Then his brow furrowed again, another question forming behind his eyes. "Was she sad because she doesn't have a daddy like me?" The question hit Randy somewhere deep in a place he hadn't known was still vulnerable. He thought about Adriana's face when she talked about her parents, about the absence that had shaped her long before her husband's betrayal, about what it meant to grow up without anyone who would always be there. Something like that. Jalen considered this for a moment, then returned to his reading assignment. But before Randy could relax, one more question emerged. "Were you scared of her, Daddy?" Randy frowned. "Scared? No. Why would I be scared?" His son shrugged, already focused on matching a picture of an apple to its corresponding word. I don't know. She looked like me when I miss mommy. That's all. The words hung in the air after Jalen went back to his assignment. Randy sat there staring at his son, wondering when a 5-year-old had become wiser than him, wondering what it meant that a child could see what he had been refusing to acknowledge. The crying lady looked like Jalen when he missed his mother. Lost, confused, desperately hoping someone would notice. Randy didn't respond. He just sat there watching his son learn to read, feeling something shift inside him that he couldn't quite name. 2 weeks after the midnight visit, an email arrived that changed everything. It came from Adriana's executive assistant formal and carefully worded requesting Randy's presence at a cafe on 5th Street at 7 o'clock that evening. The message made clear this was not a work-related matter. Randy read it 3 times. His finger hovered over the delete button, ready to make the problem disappear. He could ignore this, could pretend it never arrived, could continue building his walls and protecting his invisibility and doing all the things that had kept him safe for 34 years. But Jalen's voice echoed in his head. She looked like me when I miss mommy. He typed back a single word, confirmed. The cafe was nearly empty when Randy arrived, one of those quiet neighborhood places that survived on regulars rather than foot traffic. He spotted Adriana in a corner booth and almost walked past without recognizing her. Gone was the sharp blazer and perfectly styled hair. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. No heavy makeup concealed the fatigue beneath her eyes. No designer watch announced her status. She looked smaller, somehow younger, like someone had removed the armor she usually wore and left only the person underneath. She stood when she saw him, then seemed uncertain whether to shake his hand or simply wait. Randy resolved the awkwardness by sliding into the booth across from her without any greeting. I wasn't sure you would come. Her voice carried none of the authority he associated with boardrooms and merger meetings. I wasn't sure either. She smiled at that, though it didn't reach her eyes. Thank you for the other night, and for not reporting me to HR as a lunatic who showed up at your door. The thought crossed my mind. Randy signaled for coffee when a waitress drifted past. So what is this? Why am I here? Adriana wrapped her hands around her own mug, staring at the steam rising from its surface as if it contained prophecy. Can I ask you something personal? Depends on what it is. Have you ever been envious of someone truly envious? Not jealous of what they have, but envious of who they are. Randy considered the question, turning it over like a coin whose value he couldn't quite determine. Envy is a luxury. I don't have time for it. Too busy trying to get through each day. Adriana nodded slowly as if this answer confirmed something she had suspected. Then she said something that stopped the world. I'm envious of you. The words hung between them, impossible and true. Randy waited for clarification, for the punchline, for the moment when this would all make sense. Nothing came. You're envious of me. He repeated it flatly, testing whether saying it aloud would make it less absurd. The CEO of a billion-dollar company is envious of an accountant who lives in a 2-bedroom apartment with a torn couch. Yes. She met his eyes with a directness that made something shift in his chest. Because when I walked into your apartment, I could feel that someone lived there. I could see it in the drawings on the wall and the toys on the floor, in the way your son's books were stacked on the coffee table, like they actually get read. My penthouse has everything money can buy, and when I walk through the door, it feels like entering a museum, beautiful and empty. You have a child who calls you daddy. You have someone who needs you to come home. Randy set down his coffee cup harder than he intended. The ceramic met the table with a sound that made the waitress glance over. You think I chose this? His voice came out low, controlled, but there was an edge to it now that surprised even him. You think I woke up one day and decided I wanted to be a single father working a dead-end job in a company that will never promote me? I didn't choose any of this. I was pushed into it. Adriana didn't flinch. She simply waited, creating space for whatever was coming. My wife left when Jalen was barely walking. The words came out like water through a breaking dam, 3 years of silence, finally finding release. She said I wasn't ambitious enough. Said I was too careful, too safe, too afraid to take risks. And you know what? She was right. But she didn't understand why. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that felt almost dangerous. I'm a black man in a world that doesn't give people like me second chances. One mistake and everything I've built falls apart. One wrong word in a meeting and I'm the angry black man nobody wants to work with. One complaint from the wrong person and I'm out the door with nothing. I live small because I have to. because the world has never once given me room to fail. The words came faster now, years of carefully suppressed truth pouring out in a cafe on Fifth Street to a woman he barely knew. You made a mistake with your marriage. You'll recover. You'll buy a new apartment, start a new life, find someone who doesn't cheat. You have a safety net made of money and connections in a world that assumes you deserve second chances. When I make a mistake, my son goes hungry. When I take a risk, my son pays the price. He sat back suddenly exhausted by his own honesty. So don't sit there and tell me you're envious of my life. You have no idea what this life costs. The silence that followed felt alive breathing between them like a third presence. Adriana didn't look away. She didn't apologize or make excuses. She just sat there absorbing every word like someone finally being told a truth they had always suspected but never wanted to hear. You're right, her voice emerged quiet, stripped of all pretense. I don't understand, but I want to. Something shifted in Randy's chest. For the first time since she had walked into his apartment, he didn't feel like she was looking down at him. She was simply looking at him, seeing him. Maybe for the first time in his life, someone with power was actually seeing him. Why he asked the question that had been gnawing at him since that night. Why do you care what I think? Adriana took a long breath, her hands still wrapped around her coffee mug as if drawing warmth from it. Because you're the first person in years who has talked to me like I'm a human being and not a position. Everyone else either wants something from me or is afraid of me. You're neither, and I don't know what to do with that. Randy leaned back in his seat, studying her face in the dim light of the cafe. The woman sitting across from him was not the CEO who ran board meetings and negotiated billion-dollar deals. She was just a person trying to figure out who she was underneath the title she had spent her whole life building. He recognized that feeling. He had been running from the same question for years. They talked until the cafe closed about things that had nothing to do with work or money or power, about what it meant to be alone in a room full of people, about the weight of expectations that never quite fit, about the distance between who you were and who the world wanted you to be. When they finally stood to leave, something had changed between them. Not romance, not yet, maybe not ever. But something, a recognition, an understanding. A bridge between two worlds that had never been meant to connect. Randy drove home thinking about everything and nothing. He checked on Jalen, who was sleeping with his dragon drawing clutched against his chest. He stood in the doorway of his son's room for a long time, watching the rise and fall of small breaths, thinking about what it meant to have someone who needed you to come home. Then he went to bed and didn't dream at all. The rumors started 2 weeks later. Randy heard them first in the break room, fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly when he entered. He caught sideways glances in the hallway, the kind of looks that carried more weight than simple curiosity. Someone had seen them at the cafe. Someone had talked, and now the story was spreading through the building like fire through dry grass. Did you hear about the accountant from the 4th floor? The black guy. They say he's sleeping with the CEO to get a promotion. Why else would she meet with him outside the office? Randy kept his head down and did his job the same way he always had. He processed spreadsheets. He caught errors. He made himself invisible in all the ways he had spent years perfecting. But the weight of the whispers pressed down on him like a physical thing, making every moment in the building feel like walking through hostile territory. Marcus cornered him by the coffee machine 3 days after the rumors started. The older man's face held concern and something that might have been fear. You need to be careful. The words came out barely above a whisper. Reynolds is looking for a reason to take you down after what happened in that meeting. If these rumors get any traction, he'll use them. There's nothing to use. Randy kept his voice flat and motionless. We had coffee, that's all. Doesn't matter what actually happened. Matters what people believe happened. Marcus shook his head slowly. I've seen this before. Management finds a story they like, they stick with it, whether it's true or not. And you know how this goes for people who look like us. Randy did know. He knew it in his bones, in the careful way he had learned to move through the world, in every decision he had made to stay invisible rather than risk being seen. What do you want me to do? He asked the question, even though he already knew the answer. Stay away from her. Marcus met his eyes with an urgency that made Randy's stomach clench. Whatever's happening, whatever you think might happen, it's not worth your job. It's not worth your son's future. Randy nodded without saying anything. He went back to his desk and stared at spreadsheets without seeing them for the rest of the afternoon. That night, he picked up Jalen and drove home in silence. He made dinner on autopilot. He read the bedtime story without processing a single word. And after his son fell asleep, he sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone, thinking about what Marcus had said. Stay away from her. It was good advice. It was a smart play. It was exactly what Randy would have done 3 weeks ago before an elevator ride, in a midnight knock, in a conversation in a cafe that had changed something he couldn't name. His phone buzzed with a text, Adriana's number, which he had saved despite knowing he shouldn't. Can I see you this weekend? Jalen too, if that's okay. I'd like to meet him properly. Randy stared at the message for a long time. He thought about Marcus, about Reynolds, about the whispers in the hallways and the looks in the break room, about everything he had to lose and everything he had spent 34 years protecting. Then he thought about his son's question. Was she sad because she doesn't have a daddy like me? He typed back 2 words, Saturday afternoon. The visit lasted 3 hours and changed everything. Adriana arrived with a small brown teddy bear, soft and simple, with a ribbon around its neck. Jalen's eyes went wide when she handed it to him, and he immediately declared that its name was Mr. Breakfast, because that was when Daddy was happiest, and the bear should be happy too. Randy watched from the kitchen doorway as this woman who commanded boardrooms sat cross-legged on his living room floor, looking at crayon drawings with the focused attention of someone studying great art. She asked questions about each picture. Why did the dragon have sneakers? What was the fish's name? Why were there always 2 people holding hands? Jalen answered everything with the unfiltered honesty of childhood. The dragon had sneakers because dragons got cold feet. The fish was named George after his best friend from school, and the 2 people were always holding hands because that was him and Daddy, and they did everything together. Adriana's eyes glistened when she heard that last answer. She glanced at Randy, something unspoken passing between them, then turned back to Jalen and asked if he would draw a picture for her to keep. The boy's face lit up like someone had flipped a switch. He grabbed his crayons and set to work immediately, tongue poking out in concentration, the way it always did when he was focused on something important. Randy made coffee and brought it to the living room, settling into the armchair, while Adriana sat on the floor beside his son. The domestic tableau felt surreal, like something from a parallel universe, where his life had taken completely different turns. He's amazing, Adriana kept her voice low so Jalen wouldn't hear. You've done an incredible job with him. He makes it easy. Randy watched his son add what appeared to be wings to a figure that might have been a person or might have been a very optimistic elephant. Kids are simple. They just want to be loved and paid attention to. The rest takes care of itself. Is that really all it takes? That's all any of us want, isn't it? Randy met her eyes. To be loved, to be seen, to know that someone will be there when things fall apart. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight neither of them fully understood. Jalen finished his drawing and held it up triumphantly. 3 figures this time. 1 tall one, medium, 1 small, all holding hands. Beneath them in shaky kindergarten letters, he had written, Friends. Adriana took the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. She studied it for a long moment, then looked at Randy with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Can I keep this? It's yours now. Jalen said this with the authority of someone conferring a great honor. I made it specially for you. Thank you. Adriana's voice cracked on the words. I'll treasure it. She stayed for dinner, helping Randy in the kitchen, while Jalen watched cartoons in the living room. They worked in comfortable silence, passing ingredients back and forth, moving around each other, with an ease that surprised them both. When their hands brushed, reaching for the same spatula, neither pulled away immediately. After Jalen went to bed, they sat on the torn couch with coffee and talked about nothing and everything. Adriana told stories about growing up in a house where success was the only acceptable outcome. Randy told stories about his grandmother, who had raised 6 children on a teacher's salary and still managed to make every single one of them feel like the center of the universe. When she finally left, it was nearly midnight. She paused at the door, teddy bear drawing clutched against her chest. Thank you for today, for letting me in. Randy leaned against the door frame, exhausted in a way that felt good rather than depleting. Thank you for wanting to be let in. She smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her entire face. Then she was gone, and Randy was alone with the silence of his apartment and the strange new shape his life was taking. The HR summons arrived 4 days later. Randy received the email at 2 o'clock and was sitting in the Human Resources Director's office by 2:30. The room was small and beige, decorated with motivational posters that seemed to mock the conversation about to take place. A plant in the corner was either artificial or dying, and Randy couldn't tell which. Mrs. Bradley sat behind her desk with reading glasses perched on her nose and a folder open in front of her. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Mr. Samuel, I'll be direct. There have been allegations regarding your relationship with Ms. Wells. The board is concerned that there may be a personal involvement that could constitute a conflict of interest or a violation of company policy. Randy felt his pulse quicken, but years of practice kept his face neutral. What kind of allegations that you and Ms. Wells are engaged in a romantic relationship? That you have been meeting outside of work hours? That there may be favoritism involved in your employment status? The words hit him like ice water. He thought about Jolin, about the apartment, about the bills on the kitchen counter, and the careful balance of a life held together by discipline and caution. About everything he stood to lose if this went wrong. Is there a question in there? Mrs. Bradley folded her hands on the desk, her expression unreadable. Do you have a romantic relationship with Ms. Wells? Two paths opened before him in that moment. He could tell the truth that Adriana had come to him in crisis, that they had talked, that something complicated and undefined had begun to grow between them. He could stand up for himself and for her. Or he could survive. I've met with Miss Wells a few times, but the words came out before Randy could stop them, his survival instincts overriding everything else. Strictly professional. She consulted me on some accounting matters related to the merger. There's nothing personal between us. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He felt something inside him crack, even as the words emerged, some piece of the person he wanted to be breaking off and falling away. Mrs. Bradley studied him for a long moment, her eyes revealing nothing. Then she nodded slowly. Very well. We'll note your statement in the file. You're free to go. Randy stood and walked toward the door, his legs feeling strange and distant beneath him. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw her. Adriana stood at the far end of the corridor just outside the boardroom. She was too far away for him to read her expression clearly, but somehow he knew. She had heard everything. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air conditioning whispered through vents that needed cleaning. The building went on around them, oblivious to the small tragedy unfolding in this unremarkable hallway. Then Adriana turned and walked away without a word. The look in her eyes stayed with Randy the whole drive home. Not anger, not betrayal, just a deep, tired sadness. The expression of someone who had learned long ago that people always chose safety over loyalty. He had proven her right. That night after Jolin fell asleep, clutching Mr. Breakfast against his chest, Randy sat in the doorway of his son's room and stared at nothing. The teddy bear's ribbon caught the light from the hallway. The dragon drawings covered the walls. Everything in this small space spoke of love and hope and the impossible optimism of childhood. Randy thought about his father, who had worked 2 jobs his entire life and never complained about any of it. He thought about his mother, who had told him every day to keep his head down, work hard, and never give them a reason to notice him. He thought about his ex-wife standing in the doorway of their old apartment with suitcase in hand, telling him he would never be anything more than what he was. And he thought about what he had taught Jolin. All those bedtime conversations about bravery and kindness and standing up for what was right. All those promises that Daddy would always be there, would always tell the truth, would always be someone his son could be proud of. Today, in that beige office with its dying plant and motivational posters, Randy had done exactly what he taught his son never to do. He had shrunk. He had hidden. He had denied someone who trusted him just to protect a job he didn't even like. Jolin stirred in his sleep, pulling the teddy bear closer. His lips moved slightly, forming words Randy couldn't hear. Randy sat there for the long time, watching his son dream, feeling the weight of his own cowardice settling into his bones. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he would figure out how to fix this. But even as he thought it, he knew that some things once broken could never be fully repaired. Randy did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table until 3 a.m, staring at a blank sheet of paper, while the apartment settled into silence around him. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street below. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at shadows only it could see. At some point, his hand found a pen and began to move. The words that emerged were not for Adriana. They were for Jolin, for a future version of his son who would someday be old enough to understand what his father had done and why. I have spent my whole life being afraid. The pen scratched across paper in handwriting that grew messier with each line. Afraid of being seen. Afraid of being judged. afraid of giving the world a reason to take what little I have. I thought I was protecting you by teaching you to be careful. But careful is not the same as brave, and I have been confusing the two for 34 years. He wrote about his own father who had worked himself into an early grave without ever once standing up for himself. He wrote about his mother whose advice had kept him safe but never happy. He wrote about the morning he woke to find his wife gone and how part of him had been relieved because at least he no longer had to pretend to be someone he wasn't. He wrote until the sun began to lighten the sky outside the kitchen window. When Jolin emerged from his bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes with Mr. Breakfast tucked under one arm, Randy folded the letter and slipped it into his wallet. "Daddy, are you okay?" Randy looked at his son, at the teddy bear that connected them to a woman he had betrayed, at the eyes that saw everything and forgave even more, at this small person who had somehow become his teacher without either of them realizing it. "I'm going to be Buddy, I promise." He meant it this time, not as a comfort or a deflection, but as a vow to himself and to this child who deserved a father worth being proud of. Randy arrived at the office before anyone else. The building stood empty in the early morning light, its glass facade reflecting a sky that was just beginning to turn from gray to gold. He took the elevator to the fourth floor, then walked directly to the HR department and sat in the hallway outside Mrs. Bradley's door. The wait lasted 47 minutes. Other employees began arriving, giving Randy curious looks as they passed. He ignored them all, focused entirely on what he was about to do and what it might cost him. Mrs. Bradley appeared at 8:32, her reading glasses already perched on her nose and a coffee cup in one hand. She stopped short when she saw Randy waiting. "Mr. Samuel, is there something I can help you with?" "Yes." Randy stood straightening his tie with hands that were steadier than he expected. "I need to correct the statement I gave yesterday." Something flickered across Mrs. Bradley's face. Caution, perhaps, or curiosity. She unlocked her office door and gestured for him to enter, closing it firmly behind them. The room looked exactly as it had the day before. Same beige walls, same motivational posters, same plant that Randy now realized was definitely artificial. He remained standing while Mrs. Bradley settled behind her desk. "Yesterday you asked if I had a personal relationship with Miss Wells." Randy kept his voice level, each word deliberate. "I told you it was strictly professional." That wasn't true. The air in the small office seemed to thicken. Mrs. Bradley removed her glasses and set them carefully on the desk, her eyes never leaving Randy's face. "Miss Wells and I are friends." The word felt inadequate for what existed between them, but it was true enough. "We have spent time together outside of work. We have talked about things that had nothing to do with accounting or the merger. There has been no romantic relationship and no professional favoritism, but I was not honest with you yesterday, and I need to fix that." Mrs. Bradley's expression remained unreadable. "Mr. Samuel, do you understand what you are saying? This could affect your employment status. It could affect your entire career. I understand. Then why are you telling me this?" Randy thought about the letter in his wallet, about the words he had written in the dark hours of the morning, about the man he wanted his son to see when he looked at his father. "Because I have a 5-year-old son at home, and every day I tell him to be brave, to stand up for himself, to never let anyone make him feel small." His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "Yesterday I looked at that boy and realized I was teaching him the opposite. I was teaching him that lying is acceptable if you are scared enough, that protecting yourself matters more than protecting the people who trust you. I will not do that anymore. If you want to fire me, but I am done denying someone who trusted me just to keep a job I never loved in the first place." The silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Mrs. Bradley studied him with an expression that might have been respect or might have been pity. Randy couldn't tell which and found that he didn't care. "I will update the file." Her voice emerged softer than before, stripped of its official detachment. "You can go, Mr. Samuel." Randy nodded and walked out of the office. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally catching up with him. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, his chest did not feel tight. The weight he had carried for 34 years had not disappeared, but it had shifted somehow, redistributed into something he could actually bear. He found Adriana's address in the company directory the same way she had found his. Her building rose 30 stories above downtown Cleveland, all glass and steel, and the kind of architectural ambition that announced wealth from blocks away. The doorman looked Randy up and down with barely concealed skepticism, but let him pass when he gave Adriana's name. The elevator ride felt endless. Randy watched the numbers climb and thought about what he would say. No perfect words presented themselves. He would have to trust that the truth would be enough. The door opened before he could knock. Adriana stood in the doorway wearing jeans and an old university sweatshirt, her hair unwashed and her feet bare. Behind her, Randy could see moving boxes stacked against walls that were already beginning to look empty. Randy. Her voice carried no emotion he could identify. What are you doing here? I went to HR this morning. I told them the truth. I told them we are friends. Something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of surprise quickly suppressed. Why? Because I was a coward yesterday. The words came out raw, unpolished, nothing like the careful speech he had rehearsed on the drive over. I chose my fear over you. I denied knowing you to protect myself. And that is not who I want to be. That is not who I want my son to see. He stepped closer, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into her features and the faint traces of tears she had not quite managed to wash away. What is happening here? Adriana stepped back, letting him see the chaos of her living room. Boxes everywhere, furniture pushed against walls, the systematic dismantling of a life that had never really been lived. I resigned this morning. Her voice carried a strange calm, like someone describing events that had happened to another person entirely. The board was going to force me out after the merger anyway. I decided to leave on my own terms. Randy walked slowly through the space, taking in details he had never noticed during his brief professional visits. Expensive art on the walls, designer furniture arranged with museum precision, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views that most people would never see. All of it beautiful, all of it empty, all of it exactly as she had described that night on his couch. You are not getting to miss this. No. Adriana sat on the arm of a white leather chair that probably cost more than Randy's car. I spent 15 years climbing to get here, and now that I am leaving, I cannot think of a single thing I want to take with me. The admission hung in the air between them. Randy thought about his own apartment, about the torn couch and the crayon drawings, and the refrigerator covered in kindergarten artwork, about how little he had compared to this and how much richer his life felt anyway. I owe you an apology. You do not owe me anything. Adriana shook her head slowly. I am the one who showed up at your door uninvited. I am the one who pulled you into my mess. I am the one who, you gave me something I did not know I needed. Randy interrupted her, his voice firm. A chance to see myself through someone else's eyes. Someone who was not judging me or afraid of me or trying to use me. And I wasted it because I was scared. He took another step closer. I do not know what we are. I do not know what this is or where it goes. But I am done pretending you do not exist. I am done pretending that the only way to protect myself is to push away everyone who gets close. Adriana looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she smiled. It was small and fragile and nothing like the confident expression she wore in boardrooms, but it transformed her entire face. Jalin asked about you, Randy added, watching her smile widen slightly. He calls you the teddy bear lady. Adriana laughed and the sound filled the empty penthouse in a way nothing else could. It echoed off the expensive walls and designer fixtures, bringing something human to a space that had been designed for everything except humanity. They talked until the afternoon light began to fade. About fear and courage and the impossible difficulty of changing who you were after decades of practice. About what came next for both of them now that the structures they had built their lives around were crumbling. About Jalin and his drawings and his absolute certainty that dragons needed sneakers because their feet got cold. When Randy finally stood to leave, Adriana walked him to the door. What happens now, I do not know. Randy paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame, but I think that might be okay. I think maybe not knowing is part of being brave. He left her standing in the doorway of her half-packed penthouse, watching him go the same way she had watched him leave her on his couch those weeks ago. But something had changed between then and now. Some wall had come down, some barrier had been crossed, some possibility had opened that neither of them had allowed themselves to imagine before. The elevator carried Randy back down to street level. He walked to his car through air that smelled like rain and possibility. He had a son to pick up a dinner, to make a bedtime story to read. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the future did not feel like something to survive. It felt like something to build. 6 months later, the world looked different. Randy still worked for the same company, though not on the 4th floor anymore. His correction to HR had triggered an investigation that uncovered a pattern of complaints Reynolds had been suppressing for years. 15 other employees had come forward with their own stories of discrimination and retaliation. The investigation was still ongoing, but Reynolds had been placed on administrative leave, and the culture of the building had begun to shift in ways that would have seemed impossible half a year ago. Marcus had been promoted to supervisor of accounts payable, a recognition that was decades overdue. He celebrated by buying Randy lunch and admitting that he had been wrong about everything. Told you to stay away from her. Marcus shook his head, marveling at how badly he had misread the situation. Should have told you to stand up instead. You told me what you thought would keep me safe. Randy smiled. That is what friends do. Randy's new position was 2 floors up in a department focused on internal compliance and ethics. The work suited him, drawing on skills he had developed at Deloitte and had almost forgotten he possessed. The salary increase allowed him to move to a slightly larger apartment, one where Jalan could have his own room, instead of sleeping in what had been intended as a dining nook. The new place still had a torn couch. Randy had brought it specifically, refusing to replace it despite being able to afford better now. Some things carried meaning that transcended their physical condition. Adriana's life had transformed even more dramatically. She had left the corporate world entirely, channeling her skills and connections into a nonprofit that helped minority women start their own businesses. The work paid 90% less than her CEO salary. She had never been happier. She came to visit every other week, sitting on the familiar torn couch and looking through Jalan's latest drawings while Randy made dinner. The boy had stopped calling her the teddy bear lady, though Mr. Breakfast still held a place of honor on his bed. Now she was simply Adriana, a friend who brought cookies and asked about dragons and treated his crayon masterpieces like gallery exhibitions. They had not defined what existed between them. No labels, no official relationship status, just 2 people who had found something unexpected in each other's company and were content to let it grow at its own pace. Randy's mother had opinions about this arrangement, delivered during her monthly phone calls, with the subtle force of a woman who had raised 3 children and buried a husband and earned the right to speak her mind. You should marry that woman before she comes to her senses. We are taking things slow, Mom. Slow is for people who have time to waste. You have a son who needs stability. You have a woman who looks at you like you hung the moon. What exactly are you waiting for? Randy did not have an answer for that, but he also did not feel rushed. For the first time in his life, he was not operating from fear or scarcity or the desperate need to control every variable. He was simply living day by day, letting the future unfold in whatever shape it wanted to take. The beach at Edgewater Park stretched along the shore of Lake Erie, its sand cool beneath Randy's feet, as he helped Jalan construct what the boy insisted was a castle for dragon royalty. The late afternoon sun painted the water in shades of gold and orange, and the city skyline rose in the distance like a promise of everything Cleveland could become. Adriana arrived with sandwiches and lemonade, settling onto a blanket nearby, and watching the construction project with appropriate seriousness. The tower keeps falling. Jalan frowned at his creation, which did seem to have structural issues. Daddy says I need to build the base stronger first. Your daddy is a smart man. Jalan considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old philosopher. Daddy is the smartest. He knows everything. Not everything, buddy. Randy sat back on his heels, surveying their sandy domain. I am still learning new things every day. Like what? Like how to be brave. Randy glanced at Adriana, who was watching them both with an expression that made his chest feel full in ways he still did not quite understand. For a long time, I thought being brave meant not being scared. But that is not right. Being brave means being scared and doing the hard thing anyway. Is it hard to do hard things sometimes? But you know what makes it easier? What? Having people who believe in you. Randy reached out and ruffled his son's hair, leaving sandy fingerprints in the dark curls. People who stick around even when things get complicated. People who see who you really are and love you anyway. Jalan thought about this for a moment. Then his face brightened with a realization that seemed to illuminate him from within. Like you and me. Like you and me. And Adriana too. Randy looked at the woman on the blanket, who had been listening to every word with that quiet attention she brought to everything. She met his eyes and smiled, and in that smile was everything they had been through and everything that might still come. And Adriana too. The boy nodded with satisfaction, then returned to his castle with renewed determination. The base needed work. The towers kept collapsing. But he attacked the problem with the cheerful persistence that seemed to be his default setting, confident that effort and patience would eventually produce results. Randy moved to sit beside Adriana on the blanket close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The evening breeze carried the smell of lake water in summer and possibilities that had no names yet. He asked about me this morning. Adriana kept her voice low enough that Jalin could not hear. Whether you were going to marry me, what did you tell him? That some things take time. That grown-ups have to be sure before they make big decisions. That rushing important things usually leads to regret. Randy absorbed this watching his son battle entropy in the form of unstable sand architecture. Sounds reasonable? He also asked if I loved you. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than the summer humidity. Randy turned to look at her, finding her eyes already waiting for his. What did you tell him? Adriana smiled, and there was nothing uncertain in it. I told him the truth. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Some truths were spoken in words, and others were spoken in presence, in the accumulation of moments shared, in difficulties weathered, in quiet evenings, watching a boy learn to read and drawing dragons with sneakers because their feet got cold. Randy thought about everything that had brought them to this beach. The elevator ride, the midnight knock, the conversations that had stripped away pretense and left only two people trying to figure out who they actually were. The fear he had carried for 34 years and the courage he was slowly learning to replace it with. I spent my whole life making myself small because I thought that was the only way to survive. His voice came out quiet, meant only for her. And then you knocked on my door and I learned something I wish I had known decades ago. That sometimes the people who seem to have everything are just as lost as the people who seem to have nothing. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone see you when you are falling apart. Adriana reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cool against his palm, her grip firm and certain. You taught me something too. What? That a life filled with things is not the same as a life filled with meaning. That success measured in dollars is worthless if you have no one to share it with. That the words "I am always there" are the most valuable promise a person can make. They sat in silence for a while, watching Jalin work on his castle while the sun sank lower toward the water. The city skyline caught the fading light and turned it into something magical, towers of glass and steel transformed into monuments of gold. Daddy Jalin's voice carried across the beach, sharp with excitement. I did it. The tower is staying up. Randy squeezed Adriana's hand, once then stood and walked over to inspect his son's achievement. The tower was crooked. The walls were uneven. The whole structure listed slightly to the left in a way that suggested imminent collapse. It was perfect. Great job, buddy. Randy knelt beside his son, eye level with the sandy creation. You figured it out. The base has to be strong. Jalin repeated the lesson with the pride of someone who had earned wisdom through struggle. Then everything else can be as tall as you want. That is exactly right. They stood together and looked at the castle, father and son, while the lake lapped at the shore and the sun painted the sky in colors that had no names. Adriana joined them, slipping her hand into Randy's as naturally as if they had been doing this for years. Jalin reached up and took her other hand, completing a chain that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Three figures on a beach at sunset, connected by grip and circumstance, and something that had grown between them without anyone planning it. Can we come back here tomorrow? Jalin asked. We can come back whenever you want. And the next day too. And the next day too. Forever. Randy looked at Adriana. She looked back at him. In her eyes, he saw the same question, the same hope, the same tentative willingness to believe that some things could actually last. Forever is a long time, buddy. Randy squeezed his son's hand. But we can try for as long as we can. That is all any of us can do. Jalin seemed satisfied with this answer. He released their hands and ran toward the water, chasing waves with the boundless energy of childhood, leaving sandy footprints that the lake would erase and replace with new ones tomorrow. Randy and Adriana stood together and watched him go. He is going to be okay. Adriana's voice carried certainty that Randy desperately wanted to believe. With you as his father, he is going to be more than okay. I hope so. I know so. She turned to face him fully, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before. A decision made, a threshold crossed. I am not going anywhere, Randy. I know we have not defined this. I know we are taking things slow. But I need you to understand something. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I am here. For him, for you, for however long you will have me. The words landed in Randy's chest and took root there, filling spaces he had not known were empty. He thought about his father who had worked himself to death without ever experiencing this feeling. He thought about his mother, who had spent her whole life teaching him to protect himself from a world she believed would always hurt him. He thought about his ex-wife, who had looked at his caution and seen cowardice, not understanding that survival sometimes required making yourself small. And he thought about his audience running through the shallow water with arms outstretched, laughing at waves that would never catch him. I have spent 34 years learning how to be afraid. Randy's voice emerged steady, certain unlike